Two groups of early humans, strangers to each other, spot movement across an open valley. Neither knows the other's language. Neither knows if the other is armed, sick, hungry, or desperate. There's no flag to wave, no universal gesture guaranteed to mean peace. Just two clusters of people, frozen at a distance, trying to decide in seconds whether what they're looking at is an opportunity or a death sentence. This moment happened more times in human history than almost anything else we don't talk about. And the choices made in those first few seconds may have shaped more of who we are today than any war, any invention, any single discovery. Start with the obvious assumption, the one most people carry without questioning it. Early human tribes met, and violence followed. It's a clean story, easy to believe, reinforced by decades of pop culture showing prehistoric encounters as instant club fights. But the actual evidence tells something messier and honestly more interesting. Genetic research has quietly dismantled the simple version of this story. When scientists sequenced Neanderthal DNA and compared it to modern humans, they found something nobody fully expected. Most people with European or Asian ancestry carry somewhere between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA. That number doesn't come from occasional accidental contact. It reflects sustained interbreeding across thousands of years, meaning two separate human species didn't just encounter each other once and retreat. They lived close enough, long enough, to have children together, repeatedly, across an enormous span of time. Which means the very first assumption, stranger equals enemy, wasn't universally true at all. Sometimes stranger meant something else entirely. But it wasn't simple, and it definitely wasn't always peaceful either. Because alongside that genetic evidence sits something far grimmer. Skeletal remains found at sites like Jebel Sahaba in Sudan, dated to roughly 13,000 years ago, showed dozens of individuals with embedded stone projectile points, fractured bones, and wound patterns consistent with organized violence rather than isolated accidents. This is widely considered one of the earliest documented examples of large-scale intergroup conflict in human history. So both things happened. Cooperation and cousins on one hand, coordinated killing on the other. The real question isn't which one is true. It's what determined which outcome a given encounter would land on. And that answer seems to come down to something surprisingly practical. Resources, and how much of them existed to share. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer societies, groups whose lifestyles offer the closest living comparison to ancient patterns, have found something consistent across wildly different regions. When resources were abundant, unfamiliar groups crossing paths tended toward cautious curiosity rather than immediate hostility. Trade, intermarriage, and shared ritual gatherings show up repeatedly in the archaeological and ethnographic record during periods of relative plenty. But when resources tightened, when a territory could no longer support both groups relying on it, that same caution collapsed fast, replaced by exactly the kind of organized violence found at sites like Jebel Sahaba.
In other words, ancient humans weren't hardwired for war. They were hardwired for calculation. Every unfamiliar face represented a question mark, and the answer depended almost entirely on whether cooperating or competing offered a better shot at survival that particular season. This is where something remarkable starts to emerge. Something that separates humans from nearly every other species capable of group conflict. We didn't just fight or flee. We negotiated. Researchers studying the emergence of trade networks have traced obsidian, a volcanic glass prized for tool-making, moving hundreds of kilometers from its source in some of the earliest known exchange systems, well before agriculture, before permanent settlements, before anything resembling formal economies. That kind of movement doesn't happen through raiding alone. It requires repeated, relatively peaceful contact between groups willing to exchange uods they didn't personally produce, trusting at least enough that the other side would hold up their end. Trust between strangers. That's not a small thing for a species this cautious about outsiders. It suggests something was developing alongside the fear, some early version of diplomacy, built not from kindness necessarily, but from the same practical math driving everything else. A trading partner alive tomorrow is more valuable than a trading partner dead today. There's a psychological layer underneath all of this, too, one modern researchers have only recently started connecting back to these ancient encounters. Studies on in-group and out-group bias show the human brain processes unfamiliar faces differently within milliseconds, activating heightened amygdala response before any conscious judgment even forms. This isn't unique to ancient tribes. It's still measurable in people today, an old reflex firing regardless of whether the stranger in question poses any real threat at all. What's changed isn't the reflex, it's everything built on top of it: language, law, shared institutions, all designed, whether anyone realizes it or not, to override that first automatic flinch long enough for something more useful to happen instead. Which brings the story to something worth sitting with for a moment. Every one of us alive today descends from an unbroken chain of these encounters, moments where two unfamiliar groups faced each other across a landscape and somehow, enough times, chose connection over conflict. Not always, not even most of the time necessarily, but often enough that trade networks spread, that genes mixed across species lines, that entire populations survived long enough to become the ancestors of everyone reading this right now. Maybe that's the part worth remembering. The instinct to fear a stranger is old, real, and still sitting quietly inside every human brain. But so is something else, older than most people give it credit for. The instinct to look across that same distance and wonder, just long enough, whether this particular stranger might be worth the risk of walking closer instead of walking away.